From his tragic childhood to his tumultuous reign and violent end, the feeble and weak-minded Henry VI managed to send England into a complete tailspin, starting the brutal War of the Roses. Henry VI lived out his final days as a captive in the Tower of London. It was officially said that he died of melancholy in May of 1471. However, centuries later, the Mad King's corpse was dug up, and it told a much darker tale. But we'll come to that later. Henry VI was born with extremely large shoes to fill. His father was King Henry V, one of the most legendary warrior kings in history. Henry V was brutal, cunning, and ruthless, and his reign saw England become more powerful than it had ever been. Henry V was so unstoppable, he got the King of France to name him heir to the throne, just to stop his warpath. While on campaign, he also caught a glimpse of the French king's stunning daughter, Catherine of Valois. He married her soon after, and she gave birth to Henry VI. Henry V was all set to become the King of France. All he had to do was outlive the feeble King Charles VI. Only he didn't make it. Henry V was only 35 years old when he suddenly fell ill and died. England's fortunes died with him. Instead, the infant Henry VI became king. And no one realized it at the time, but that was probably the worst thing that could have possibly happened for England. Henry V's death devastated his widowed Catherine of Valois, and she took solace in her beloved child. However, the English nobles didn't trust the French princess to begin with. Afraid she'd influence the future king against them, they kept her away from her child as much as possible. Henry V's death changed everything. Technically, Henry VI should have become King of France, but the French weren't about to let a squalling infant claim the crown, especially not an English one. The French were quick to ignore the promise and named Charles VII King of France. Scrambling, the English named their own Henry VI King of France in opposition. Henry VI holds two important distinctions in history. He's the youngest King of England ever, and he's the only King of England to become the King of France also. In Henry's defense, he took the throne at a pretty rough time in England. His father's military campaigns had taken a toll on the English economy, leading to a depression known as the Great Slump. Henry's mother, Catherine, saw her star fall extremely quickly. One day, she was the Queen of England and set to become the Queen of France as well. She found solace in the arms of a man named Owen Tudor. Though Catherine and Tudor were nobodies in their day, their union would form the basis of one of the most powerful dynasties in English history. With Henry V gone, the French set about reclaiming the lands he'd conquered. Having Joan of Arc at the helm, English holdings in France had been steadily shrinking for years. When Henry VI took over, he did nothing to help matters. Fighting scared him, and he listened to anyone who suggested that he seek peace with France. Many in England were furious that their new king would so readily give up the lands they fought tooth and nail for, and Henry soon found himself with some powerful enemies. One of the loudest voices who spoke for fighting in France was Richard, Duke of York. Henry's pursuit of peace did lead to his marriage to the gorgeous and cunning French princess, Margaret of Anjou. Henry's supporters suggested that he marry Margaret, and he was all too desperate to agree. He just needed the approval of King Charles VII of France, who was no fool. Charles was a far more effective ruler than Henry, and he made sure to take the English king to the cleaners. He actually got the English king to give him the extremely valuable French province of Maine. Henry and his advisors were well aware that giving up Maine would be extremely unpopular, and when the public found out, they were absolutely furious. In just a few years, they went from having a king who conquered much of France to one who gave up that land for practically nothing. If you thought that losing Maine was rock bottom for Henry VI, you'd be mistaken. The following year saw England completely go to the dogs. The economy didn't improve, corruption became rampant at every level of government, and the countryside fell to anarchy as law and order completely broke down. One of Henry's favorite advisors was the Duke of Suffolk. Notably, Suffolk was the driving force behind seeking peace in France. He'd been the one to suggest marriage to Margaret of Anjou, and he'd been quick to agree that Maine was a fair price to pay. A more effective king might have been able to protect Suffolk, but Henry was pretty much useless. He powerlessly watched as Parliament impeached Suffolk in front of an angry mob calling for the man's blood. Realizing that his friend's life was in danger, Henry bent to the mob's will and exiled Suffolk. But that wasn't good enough for his enemies. Though Henry VI was a catastrophic failure of a king, it's not like he didn't accomplish anything. He hated fighting, but he was very interested in other matters, such as religion and education. He actually founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, two legendary institutions that stand to this day. Eventually, Henry decided to fight for his territories in France, but he still managed to screw it up. He made the hapless Duke of Somerset the leader of the English forces. Somerset made a complete mess of things across the water. Within a year of taking up the fight, the Duke had lost all of Normandy. Pushed out of France, many beleaguered Englishmen limped back to English shores, only to find that there was no money to pay them. Many of these men took to roaming the countryside, raiding villages to keep food on the table. England became a truly scary place to live, and Henry VI was incapable of doing anything about it. The French weren't stopping either. They kept going until England possessed nothing but the city of Calais in the north. Just a few decades earlier, it seemed like France was set to become just another English province, but Henry VI lost it all in a matter of years. The news that he'd lost the city of Bordeaux quite literally drove Henry insane. He had a total mental breakdown and became completely unresponsive for over a year. After spending the better part of a decade waiting for a child with his wife, even the birth of his son, Edward of Westminster, couldn't snap him out of it. Modern historians believe that Henry's madness might have been caused by schizophrenia. While Henry was incapacitated, his enemies began to gather. Richard, the Duke of York, who'd been such a vocal critic of Henry, used his power and influence to get himself named as Protector of the Realm while Henry couldn't rule. York also had allied with another of England's most powerful men, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, better known as the Kingmaker. York and Warwick were smart, so they realized that their greatest threat wasn't Henry. It was the ruthless Queen Margaret of Anjou. So when York became protector, he quickly marginalized Margaret, allowing her absolutely no say in matters of state. To plant the seed of doubt in the English people, York and Warwick spread rumors that Margaret was having an affair with the Duke of Somerset and that her son, Edward of Westminster, wasn't actually Henry's. Not only did this make people distrust their French queen even more, but it also opened the door for someone else to become Henry's heir, namely York himself. Henry finally came to his senses around Christmas of 1454, and he woke up to a world that was completely different than the one he left. He had a son. Richard of York was protector of the realm. Nobles were saying that York should usurp him and take the throne. Yet again, Henry found himself in a tense situation that required firm leadership. And what did he do? He made everyone hold hands. Henry VI's great plan to ease tensions and save his reign was to hold a holiday called Love Day. In 1458, Henry forced all of England's most important nobles to hold hands and walk from Westminster Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral. He specifically tried to make sure that the people who hated each other the most walked hand in hand. He coupled Richard of York himself with Queen Margaret of Anjou. If there was anyone Richard of York hated more than Margaret of Anjou, it was probably the Duke of Somerset. York was a cunning and capable leader, while Somerset was pretty much useless. So imagine how furious York was when Henry exiled him away in Ireland and set the sycophantic Somerset off to France. As if sitting in Ireland as his incompetent rival lost all of England's territory in France wasn't bad enough, Richard still had Margaret of Anjou to deal with. The vicious queen allegedly made several attempts on York's life while he was staying in Ireland, but to no avail. While he was protector, Richard had Somerset thrown behind bars, to the delight of many. Somerset's failures in France were a national embarrassment, and few were sad to see him go. But as soon as Henry came back to the world of the living, he released Somerset and gave him all of his power back. Finally fed up with his embarrassment of a king, Richard of York decided to take matters into his own hands. Well aware that the newly restored Duke of Somerset would probably bring charges against him, he gathered an army and set off to face Somerset directly. The first Battle of St. Albans might not seem like that big a deal on paper. 5,000 men took part and fewer than 60 were lost. However, on a political scale, it couldn't have been more important. Richard of York achieved his main goal, with the Duke of Somerset dying in battle. But he accomplished so much more than that. He managed to capture Henry VI and force the king to name him as Lord Protector of England. Soon, the king's Lancastrians and Richard's Yorkists were battling once again. Just 2 years later, the two sides met on the field at the Battle of Northampton. Though feeble, Henry himself showed up on the battlefield, with his fierce wife Margaret and young son Edward at his side. Henry's armies faced the combined forces of Richard of York and the Kingmaker at the Battle of Northampton. The rebels routed Henry's men, and once again they managed to take the feeble king prisoner. With the king his prisoner, Richard of York forced Henry VI to disinherit his own son and make him heir to the throne. Up to this point, Richard of York seemed like he couldn't lose, but he underestimated his greatest enemy, Margaret of Anjou. While York had held her husband captive and made a mockery of the crown, Margaret went out and raised an army to fight for what was hers. Beggars can't be choosers, so Margaret had to take anyone she could get, and that meant the roving bands of outlaws in the English countryside were fair game. With her son by her side, she convinced these men that York was a deceiver and that her boy was the true heir to the throne. The Battle of Wakefield could not have been a bigger disaster for the Yorkist cause. Margaret of Anjou's forces completely decimated the York army, but the real victory was that Richard of York himself lay dead. Though Margaret had defeated Richard, the Yorkists weren't about to roll over and concede defeat. Even with their figurehead gone, that didn't change the fact that the Mad King had to go. Fortunately for them, Richard had a son, Edward, who was everything Henry VI wasn't. Rejuvenated under Edward of York's leadership, the Yorkists went back on the warpath. During a raging March snowstorm, the two armies faced off at the Battle of Towton, and this time, York ended up on top. After the brutal victory, Edward finally did what his father never had the guts to do. He deposed Henry VI and crowned himself King Edward IV. The deposed king and queen fled north to Scotland, where they bided their time and planned their next move. Many of their supporters abandoned London and traveled north to join the exiled monarchs. Edward charged north after Henry and Margaret and quickly defeated Henry's forces, but the king managed to escape. While Henry hid out in Lancashire, a treacherous monk tipped off his location to some local Yorkists. They captured him and dragged him back to London, where Edward had him thrown in the Tower of London. Margaret of Anjou fled to France while her husband was captive, and eventually one of her greatest enemies came to her begging for help. Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. It turns out, back in England, things were not going as smoothly as it seemed. Edward IV had Richard Neville to thank for the crown on his head, but once he was king, Edward didn't want to listen to anyone. The final straw came when he went and married the beautiful yet low-born Elizabeth Woodville. Neville had worked tirelessly to find a political match for Edward who would solidify his rule. The king marrying Woodville was basically a slap in the face. After fighting tooth and nail to see Henry VI removed from the throne, Neville came to a sobering realization. An idiot king was better than a king who wouldn't listen. So he ended up making an alliance with his greatest enemy. The kingmaker had made one king already, so why not make another? Joining forces with Margaret in France, Neville sailed back across the English Channel, attacked London, forced Edward to flee, and freed Henry from the Tower. Henry was so far gone by the time Neville freed him from the Tower of London, he allegedly had to be led through the city of London by the hand like a child. For his part, the kingmaker couldn't be happier with Henry's near catatonic state. It left him completely free to run the country as he saw fit, until he made a fatal mistake by declaring war on Burgundy. Before Neville attacked Burgundy, Edward IV had been pretty much out of luck. He had no great army to speak of, and he had to sit and watch as the Mad King daydreamed on the throne where he once sat. But Neville's plan changed everything. The Duke of Burgundy gave Edward an army to put the kingmaker down for good. Mere months after Margaret and Neville deposed him, Edward sailed back to England with that very army. He met Neville on the field at the Battle of Barnet, and this time, he came out on top. Neville lost his life in the fighting, but Edward was far from satisfied. By this point, Henry and Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, had grown into a young man. He was the kind of figurehead that the Lancastrian armies could rally around, and King Edward IV couldn't have that. He met Henry's heir at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and again came out the victor. Edward of Westminster lay dead at just the age of 17. Henry VI's final stint in the Tower of London didn't last long. The official records said the deposed king died of melancholy about a month after he arrived. However, as soon as Henry passed, dark rumors spread through the English court. Most people assumed that a broken heart wasn't the likeliest cause of death, more like a broken skull. However, since no one ever saw the Mad King's body, nobody could say for sure whether Edward was behind his demise. But years later, archaeologists uncovered Henry's remains, and they discovered the truth. When looking at Henry's remains in 1910, what they found didn't look too melancholic. His skull was badly damaged, and his remaining tufts of blonde hair were covered with blood. It sure seems like Edward had a hand in Henry's final end. By every single metric, Henry VI was a terrible king, but his ancestors actually worshipped him. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, and Henry VI's nephew, encouraged a posthumous cult around his uncle as part of anti-Yorkist propaganda. As a result, many years after Henry VI's life, priests attributed several miracles to him, such as the ability to cure illness with the mere touch, and the ability to bring people back from the dead. It's understandable why some people eventually appreciated Henry VI. He may have been pretty much incapable of governance, but aside from that, he was a remarkably humane king. He was against horrific punishments such as drawing and quartering, and he was almost always extremely merciful with enemies. He wasn't necessarily a bad person, just a bad king who lived during an era where his poor decisions had devastating consequences. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, we'd really appreciate it. We also invite you to check out the companion article in the description below. If you want to see even more videos on historical figures, please subscribe to the channel.